Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel, or hello if you are new. In today's true crime video, we will be diving into part 2 of the Gonzales Family Murders. So if you have not seen part 1 yet, please go back and watch part 1 because this will not make any sense, obviously, if you haven't seen part 1. I just want to say, as I always do, I am in no way a professional. I do not work in any areas of crime investigation or law. I just simply like to review and learn about different crime cases from all over the world, and all this information is from online sources that are available to you guys and the general public. No disrespect is ever intended towards anyone I may mention in this video or any of my other videos. So with that being said, let's just dive into part 2 of the Gonzales family murders. So on July the 20th, 2001, a joint funeral service was held for Teddy Loiva and Claudine Gonzalez. Around 300 people actually showed up to this funeral at a church in North Ryde, Sydney, and this actually included some law enforcement that were working tirelessly on this case, but they did just want to take some time out of their day to show their respect for the deceased. Seth Gonzalez sat in the front row of his family's funeral, and he just sat with his head bowed for most of the service until he was asked to come up and present his eulogy. Seth talked about how his father was his hero and expressed a lot of grief and sadness over this tragedy, but then he proceeded to do something that was witnessed by people as being quite bizarre and just not very fitting with the etiquette of a funeral. Seth began singing a solo a cappella performance of the R&B ballad One Sweet Day by Mariah Carey. Witnesses described it as very self-indulgent, very inappropriate, and just he seemed emotionally unattached. After this, Teddy, Loiva and Claudine all proceeded to be buried together. So now, because of this strange performance at the funeral, people were starting to get very, very suspicious of Seth Gonzalez, and authorities were one step ahead of them. They were already suspicious of Seth Gonzalez on the night of the murders. When authorities arrived to the scene on the night of the murders, they witnessed Seth Gonzalez sobbing uncontrollably and in hysterics, but when they came up closer to him, they could see that there were no tears shed at all. Like, he wasn't actually crying. It was also said that Seth sounded panicked and overwhelmed on the night, but when authorities asked him questions relating to the murders, he was saying them as if they were rehearsed and planned out. Like, he had thought of what to say prior to these questions being asked to him. Like, you would think in that moment, if you were panicked and frenzied, your answers would be all over the place, understandably, but his were not. They were like they were rehearsed lines. He also said that he had performed CPR on his parents and tended to their wounds and his sister's wounds with bare hands. There were some blood stains on the bottom of his jeans and on the back sleeve of his jumper, and there were some spots of blood on his boots. This was strange because he said that he had tended to his parents and his sister by doing CPR, and the amount of blood that was at the crime scene, it was really bizarre that he had such little blood on himself. They thought that he would have been covered in blood all over his hands and his clothes, but he wasn't. There was only small bits of blood. When Seth was asked why he didn't have more blood on him, he said that the rain had washed most of the blood out of his clothes, and the reason he didn't have any blood on his hands was because he wiped them on the front lawn on the grass. Although there was bad weather in Sydney that day and that night, it was said to have only been drizzling at that time when he was outside out the front of his house. And I don't know about you guys, but I don't think that some rain is going to wash away blood staining from your clothes in such a short amount of time as well. Like, rain just doesn't wash something free from your clothing. It doesn't work like that. An officer also noticed some blue staining on Seth's jumper, which funnily enough resembled the blue spray paint that was used to write the racist message on the inside of one of the walls. and later when it was tested, it did come back to be blue paint. In Seth's bedroom in the wardrobe, officers actually found a shoebox that had originally contained a UK size 7 human brand running shoe, and the shoes themselves were missing, but if you remember, that was the exact match to the bloody footprints that were found down in the crime scene. When asked, Seth was adamant that the shoes were never his, they'd never belonged to him, and it was actually his father Teddy who had purchased the shoes for a family member over in the Philippines. Seth was asked to do a reenactment of that night with authorities so they could gain some better understanding about what had actually happened and where everyone was. But at no point during this reenactment did Seth indicate that he was traumatized or it was really hard to relive, which is a bit bizarre. Police also asked Seth to reenact how he saw the perpetrators fleeing the scene, where they were, where he was, but police ended up concluding that there was no way Seth could have seen these perpetrators fleeing the scene or on the street, because by the time Seth was out of the house, they would have already been out of sight. So again, another red flag, it didn't add up. So as I've already said previously, the CCTV cameras can confirm that Seth was not lying when he said that he was with his friend Sam and they were having dinner and then playing at the arcade between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. that night. However, prior to this, Seth was just driving around Kingsgrove because he couldn't find his house and he was just trying to fill in time, and this could not be verified. He couldn't be seen on any CCTV cameras or any footage. Not only this, but Seth's whereabouts couldn't actually be confirmed or verified by anything during the most crucial time of his family's murders, which was between 4 p.m. and 7 p.m. One of Teddy's clients had actually stopped by the Gonzales home to drop off some documents for him, and they had done so between 4:10 and 4:30 p.m. that day, and police theorized that Claudine was killed at around this time. The client told police that he had definitely seen Seth's green Ford Festiva parked in the driveway at the time he went to drop off the documents. Emily Luna, who we spoke about earlier, also recalls seeing Seth's green Ford Festiva parked in the driveway when she was trying to knock on the front door. She said that she had gotten to the property at around 6 p.m. that night and assumed because she could see Seth's car in the driveway that someone was home, even though it did look very dark and quiet. She explained to police how she rang the doorbell several times and knocked on the door, but nobody was answering. So Emily's statement makes sense because in Seth's statement, he said that he was around at the family home at that time, and it makes sense that Emily saw Seth's car there because he says that he was there at that time too. However, if you remember, Seth had said that it had been raining so heavily that he actually stayed in the car because he didn't want to get wet. Then he decided to drive to Kingsgrove instead to go find his mate, and he never actually got out of the car and went into the home. He just parked in the driveway and then left. However, a crucial bit of Emily Luna's statement is that she recalls that it was not raining anymore. She said she was thankful that it had stopped raining so her and her son could get from the car to the front door of the Gonzales home without an umbrella. She also says that she did not see Seth sitting in his green Ford Festiva on her way up to the house or on the way back to her car. So both of these statements, the rain and him sitting in the car, contradict Seth's. The two murder weapons could not be accounted for either, so the knife could not be found and the baseball bat could not be found. And one of Seth's friends actually told police that he recalled Seth saying that he kept a baseball bat in the back of his car for protection. And when Seth was asked about it, he couldn't account for its current whereabouts. Authorities were pretty sure that Seth was lying and being deceitful with them, so they ended up going to Seth's friends to just kind of get an idea of who Seth was and what he was like, what he did in his spare time, just to get to know a little bit more about him. Once they delve a little deeper and while speaking with Seth's friends, they realized how deceitful Seth Gonzalez actually had been, and it turned out that he had webbed a life of lies for years and years and years. Seth often boasted to his friends and just people in general that he was a Taekwondo expert and that he had his own security company. He told people he owned property and that he would fly to New York often to do business deals. He also told people that he managed a boy band. He was a music producer, a successful singer with a record deal. He was a world champion kickboxer, a personal trainer, a lawyer, and a manager of a modeling agency. In early 2000s, Seth actually told some of his friends that he had been diagnosed with cancer, but later told them that he'd beaten it and that he was on a road to recovery, which is just way too far. Seth had also been lying about his academic success as well. He actually had not been submitting assignments. He had not shown up for exams, meaning he actually failed his course, and this is why he dropped out of his science med degree. Teddy and Loiva actually knew about this, knew about the bad grades, and they actually threatened to take away Seth's car if he didn't screw his head on and get better grades. They were very, very pleased when Seth started to obtain really good grades in his new legal studies course, and they thought that this was because he just had a better attitude towards studying and he was in a better course for him. However, it came to light that Seth was actually forging uni documents and making it look like his grades were much better than they actually were, and his parents were believing it. Seth was actually failing all his subjects at uni. Aside from uni, Seth's romantic relationships also just weren't working out and failing. He brought one girl home to his mother, and Loiva disapproved, saying that a girlfriend was just another distraction from academics. And they actually threatened to disinherit him from the will if he didn't get rid of this girl. A family friend had actually also approached Seth because she felt that he was stealing from her purse, and he actually didn't deny it, and Teddy and Loiva weren't really surprised because they felt like he was actually stealing cash from their purses as well. It is thought that due to Teddy and Loiva's harsher punishments when Seth was growing up, that Seth took a lot of this emotional baggage into his adult life, and this caused him to be a bedwetter. And Loiva did try and seek help for her son, but Seth refused to see someone and talk to someone about it. So after the murder of his mother and father and sister, Seth was actually approved to receive $15,000 from the government as a part of a compensation scheme for being a victim of crime. So obviously this money is supposed to be used for funeral expenses and upcoming living expenses, since his mother and father cannot be there to pay for him to live anymore. But instead, Seth ended up using about half of this money to do up his mum's car, which he had taken to driving after her passing. Seth denied all accusations of him being involved in the crime. He thought that it was someone putting a hit on his family, and they kept him alive to make it look like he did it. The hitman theory rose again when Seth showed the police an anonymous email he had received saying that he was supposed to be in the home that day, and it was lucky that he wasn't, or he would be dead too. Seth was convinced that he was not safe and that his life was basically in danger, so he asked his friends to act as bodyguards for him. Later, police actually seized Seth's electronics, and lo and behold, what did they find? A draft version of the anonymous email that was supposedly sent to him by the killer, but really Seth wrote it himself. So Emily Luna, or Seth's aunt, just refused to believe that her nephew could be capable of committing a triple murder, although she was aware of some inconsistencies in his story. She actually even went with him to one of his police scheduled meetings to do his statement, and she was with him, supporting him, holding his hand while he was recounting his statement. Seth was recounting prior to the murder about the incident where he had gone and parked in the driveway but didn't get out of the car because it was raining, blah, blah, blah. And in that moment, Emily Luna actually knew that her nephew Seth was lying, because as we've already discussed, she was there and she knew that it wasn't raining because she got out without her umbrella. And in that moment, she actually pulled her hand away from Seth because she just felt very, very uncomfortable and had a very bad feeling and knew deep down in her heart that unfortunately he was lying and this all could be possible. It was possible that he was the murderer. So flashing forward just slightly, Seth was actually in a coffee shop and he was still being investigated by police, but at the moment they didn't really have anything significantly on him. They were still working on the case, and Seth was at a coffee shop just getting a coffee, sitting in the shop, minding his own business, when a stranger actually walked past and complimented his outfit. And obviously Seth was flattered and started up a conversation with this guy. This guy ended up telling Seth that he was actually a gangster and had connections to the police. Seth then also told this guy that he was in a gang too, and they were called the White Dragons Asian, which is a lie. There's no such gang, and Seth was in no such gang. The guy knew of the allegations that Seth was facing, and they got to talking, and this guy actually explained that he knew someone in prison that was dying, and this particular man in prison was actually taking responsibility for crimes that he didn't commit because he was dying. This guy asked Seth if he wanted this guy in prison to take responsibility for the Gonzales family murders, so then Seth could just have a break from constantly being harassed by authorities. Seth ended up denying this. He didn't really want to go through with that, but he did actually end up giving this gangster guy hand-drawn plans of the Gonzales family home with locations of where each body was found. Seth then also provided this guy with the times of death of each of his family members, which was the biggest mistake and one too far. The man he was speaking to was not actually a gangster. He was an undercover cop, and police had actually intentionally withheld the times of death information from the public because ultimately it was really only information that the killer knew themselves. So then Seth's handwriting was compared with the racist drawing and message on the walls that they found at the crime scene, and they did find some similarities between them. Seth had actually said to the undercover police officer, quote, "People don't suspect me. It's just Seth with a little baby face. I have a split personality. I can hide what I do. They've got nothing on me. It's all circumstantial stuff." However, Seth never admitted to any of the murders. He still maintained his innocence throughout all the conversations with the undercover officer. Seth still truly believed that it was a hitman that was sent on his family. So when authorities seized Seth's laptop, they ended up finding a bit of a disturbing search history, which involved things like what poisons can be easily disguised in food, and they actually saw some purchases that appeared to be made for two types of seeds that are actually lethal plants and lethal to humans. And they were actually coming from the USA, and they were expected to come by early July. He'd also made a search for these seeds on an Australian website, but he couldn't purchase them for some reason. He had sent an email personally to this supplier requesting that he can have these seeds and order them. And when police went to Seth and questioned him about it, he actually denied it, even though they had all these receipts and emails that prove Seth was writing this, and Seth was just denying, and he was actually even pinning some of this stuff on his father, who was deceased. Seth actually didn't know it, but when police were searching Seth's bedroom, they actually found a vial, like a small vial that contained a clear liquid that was taped under Seth's own desk, and when forensics tested it, they found that it was actually a poison that was lethal to anybody who ingested it. Days prior to the murder, Loiva Gonzalez was actually admitted to hospital because she was suffering from an intense fever and really, really bad pains in her stomach and abdominals. She pinned it to maybe food poisoning when they had eaten out at a local restaurant, and surprisingly, Seth said that he felt a little bit sick too after eating there. Investigators also found frequent search history back to a website run by a girl by the name of Daisy Diaz, who was Seth's #1 fan, who we've already talked about earlier in part 1 of the video. As we already discussed, Daisy Diaz ran this website that was a dedication to Seth and boasted about how great he was and just all this sort of cringeworthy fangirl stuff about Seth. When investigators asked Seth about Daisy Diaz and this website and what their relationship was between Seth and Daisy, he said that Daisy had recently died. Fitting, in the 9/11 attacks on America, and he even claimed to have flown to New York with Daisy Diaz's mum to attend Daisy's funeral service. Investigators soon learnt the truth about Daisy Diaz after digging a little bit more into Seth's computer, and well, basically there is no truth because Daisy Diaz is not real and she never existed ever. Seth had made Daisy Diaz up, and this meant that Seth ran the fangirl website about himself. Like, he was writing all those cringeworthy posts about himself as if it was a fan. Embarrassing. So in September of 2001, Seth told his family that he had a brain tumor. Seriously, this guy with the lies. Seth had actually contacted his aunt Annie, who was in charge of dealing with Teddy's investment properties over in the Philippines, and Seth had actually asked his aunt to send over $190,000 that he needed to have life-saving surgery to get rid of this tumor, to save his life. Annie, luckily, didn't end up sending any money whatsoever over to Seth. She actually ended up calling the authorities because she thought it was super suspicious and worth investigating, so kind of backfired in Seth's face. At this time, Seth had also not gained ownership of the family's estate yet, so he was actually asking the government for more money because we know that he was not spending his government money on appropriate things like looking after himself. He was spending it on cars. The government actually refused his requests. He managed to get something like $88,000 from selling both his parents' cars, some expensive jewelry from his mother and maybe his father, and his own Ford Festiva. Then 1 month later, Seth went ahead and put a deposit on a $175,000 Lexus, telling the dealer that he would pay the rest of the money when his inheritances come through. He actually ended up having to cancel that purchase because he couldn't get the money in time to pay the dealership. So a couple of months later, detectives actually asked Emily Luna again to come back and please do a physical reenactment of that night of the murders when she had come at around 6 p.m. that night, because she'd only given some written statements and verbal statements so far, but she hadn't done an actual reenactment. When she got to the property and started to reenact how she'd come from the car and walked up the driveway and then eventually peered in through the window, she was suddenly very surprised to see that the coat stand that she had originally thought was right at the front of the window, basically looking out at her, was actually much further back than she thought. Emily was now convinced that it was a male figure staring back at her through the window from inside the house, and she said that the figure was around 5'4", which was Seth's height. So when authorities approached Seth yet again saying, look, people have seen your car in the driveway, like a few people have seen your car in the driveway, your alibi driving around Kingsgrove is just, it can't be proven at all, so you're looking really suspicious, Seth suddenly changed his story. Seth had said that he had actually gone to a brothel that night and he had left his car in the driveway, and that is why people saw his car in the driveway. Seth claimed that he originally didn't mention it to anyone because it was shameful or could be seen as shameful upon his religion and his family and to himself. Investigators, of course, followed up this alibi, and Seth had actually given a name of the female that he spent time with in the brothel that night. And the police couldn't confirm this. They actually found out that this woman in particular that Seth had mentioned was not even working at the brothel that night. Seth then rang this particular sex worker and begged her to lie for him to the police, but she refused. Seth then convinced a taxi driver to lie on his behalf, and when investigators approached this taxi driver saying, "Did you drive Seth Gonzalez to the brothel that night?" he actually lied for Seth and said, "Yeah, I did. I drove Seth at this time or between these two times." But then the taxi driver retracted his statement when he realized that Seth was being questioned in relation to a triple homicide. So obviously the taxi driver didn't realize how serious this potential crime and this lie actually was, so he retracted it. The taxi driver said to police that Seth had actually offered him $50 to lie for him to the police, and he said that Seth said that it was just in relation to some minor, like a petty theft or something, very, very minor offense, not a triple homicide. So flashing forward a little bit to April of 2002, Seth Gonzalez was actually found laying outside in a gutter by a man, and this man had actually called an ambulance for assistance because Seth was saying that he couldn't remember who he was or what year it was. He was also saying that he was finding it very hard to breathe, and they had found a plastic bag nearby to him where they had found him. Police also arrived at the hospital and questioned Seth, asking him what happened to him, and Seth had said that he had been grabbed and taken into a vehicle by two men. Apparently, these two men had said to Seth to withdraw the reward money that Seth had put up for any information in relation to his family's murder, and they asked him to stop talking about the murder in the public and in the media. Seth then said they hit him over the head with some large object and put a plastic bag over his head and just left him in the gutter. Interestingly, doctors could not find any injuries on Seth that related to this incident, and police also couldn't find any proof that this incident had even taken place at all. So due to all this stuff building up against Seth Gonzalez, in June of 2002, so about a year after the Gonzales family murders, police actually ended up getting a search warrant to search Seth's Chatswood apartment, which is where he had been living in the time being, and they actually ended up charging him on 3 counts of murder. Once Seth was at the police station, they took his fingerprints to put into the database, and actually one of his prints came up as a match to another unidentified fingerprint that was found on a letter or an envelope that had been sent to a food manufacturer company in July of 2001. This letter that they had found was a threatening letter to the food manufacturer company, and this letter was saying that due to the poor treatment of some of their employees, that some of the company products had been infected with poison, and that they were going, to be stocked on the shelves for anyone to be able to purchase. And this could potentially be life-threatening to anybody who bought it. So it was like revenge for this company treating their employees wrongly, and now someone has poisoned some of their stock and it's gone up on the shelves and is available for the public to buy and potentially be harmed by. Australian Federal Police and Australian Quarantine and Inspection Services had actually also received similar letters like this at around a similar time. Traces of all 3 letters and the search history showing the addresses of these particular companies that the letters were sent to were all found on Seth Gonzalez's laptop. It's believed that Seth was trying to fabricate evidence that some food companies had poisonous stock on their shelves, so when Seth went to poison his own family, he could divert the suspicion away from himself and claim that, oh, well, there's been news that there's these poisonous stock in, I don't know what companies they were exactly, but for example, oh, there's poisonous stock in the supermarkets and my family went and bought this stock and ate it and that's why they died, that's why they're poisoned. And it looked as though it wouldn't have been Seth. So now, along with the 3 counts of murder charge, he was also charged with threatening product contamination. Seth's grandmother and Seth's aunt actually expressed a lot of fear if Seth was able to get out on bail, but actually Seth's bail was refused because he was considered a flight risk, which I think was appropriate. Seth also requested that the money he was going to inherit from his parents and their estate was to be used for his trial, so for a defense attorney, legal fees and things like that, but this was actually rejected. So in April of 2004, the trials for all 3 murders commenced. Seth actually testified in the trial, and he was answering questions from the prosecution, who were arguing that Seth had premeditated these murders for months and months in advance, since the premeditation to kill his mother with the poison was quite evident from his search history and the vial that they found in his bedroom. They also argued that the story that Seth had told authorities about him being attacked on the street and left in the gutter for dead was just a fabricated story to fool police. The prosecution also maintained that Seth killed his mother and father because he knew there was a very big punishment coming his way because he had failed his uni course again, and his reason for killing Claudine was because she told his parents about him failing uni in the first place. It was also noted that he probably killed Claudine as well because he was selfish. He knew that with Claudine out of the picture, he would be the sole beneficiary of their family's multi-million-dollar fortune. So due to the evidence, the prosecution concluded that on July the 10th, 2001, the day of the murders, Seth Gonzalez returned home from working at the law firm, retrieved the baseball bat and the 2 knives from the kitchen. He wore gloves and a large coat and a hat, and Seth went up to Claudine's bedroom, surprising her whilst bludgeoning and stabbing her to death, and then he covered her wounds with a red jumper. Seth then went downstairs and laid in wait for his mother to return home. At around 6 p.m, Seth confronted his mother Loiva in the living room as soon as she entered by stabbing her to death. He then waited again for his father to come home, and during this time, Emily Luna visited the Gonzalez house and saw Seth through the front window wearing a hat and coat, which gave her a fright, obviously, but her son dismissed it, saying that it was a coat rack. At 7 p.m, Teddy Gonzalez entered the front door and was immediately attacked and killed right then and there. After this, Seth took a shower to wash off, and then he staged the house to make it look like it was a robbery, and then proceeded to spray paint the wall with blue spray paint that read a racist message that made it look like it was a racially motivated hate crime, but they ended up finding the blue paint on his sweater. After this, Seth got in his car and went to dispose of his clothes that he was wearing, as well as his shoes and the murder weapons, which have never ever been found. He then picked up his mate Sam for dinner, and they made sure they went to a place that had lots of surveillance so that if he was pulled up by the police, he had an alibi that was caught on tape. When he got home, Seth called 000 and carried on to make it look like he was in complete shock and just absolutely frantic, but as we already mentioned earlier in the video, he didn't even shed one tear. On May the 20th, 2004, the jury found Seth Gonzalez guilty of the murders of Teddy, Loiva and Claudine Gonzalez. Seth was apparently visibly shocked when they read the verdict out, but I mean, he's a liar, so what do you expect? A psychiatrist was appointed to Seth to see if he had any underlying medical or mental illnesses that may have impacted on this crime, and just generally to see if he was sane or not. The psychiatrist came back saying that there was actually insufficient evidence to suggest a diagnosis. So at the sentencing, Seth was mainly just focusing all about himself. He was talking about his suffering and even telling his own family members that if they felt pain, then his is just 100 times worse. Like, he is the complete victim in this situation, and that he was not going to plead guilty to something that he didn't do. So on September 18th, 2004, Seth Gonzalez, who was now 24 years old, was sentenced with 3 life sentences without the possibility of parole. The judge stated that Seth lacked insight into the enormity of his offences and had failed to accept any responsibility for his crimes. crimes. Because Seth was actually found guilty of the triple homicide, his lesser charge of the threatening product contamination was actually dropped because he was going to prison for life anyway and he didn't have the possibility of parole. So to this day, Seth Gonzalez proclaims his innocence, but he will be in prison for the rest of his life. So flashing forward slightly, in November of 2005, the former Gonzales family home was actually purchased by new buyers who were fully aware of its history. In 2017, the owners actually spoke publicly about their purchase of the home, and they actually said they got a really good feeling as soon as they stepped inside the home. They said that they actually get very annoyed when people ask about the Gonzales family and what happened there in their house, because they say that it's their home now and that was in the past and it has nothing to do with them. They say that they knew the Gonzales family was a good family and they feel that they would be really happy to know that someone else has taken over their home and really loves it and is taking really good care of it and making brand new memories in it. I've actually done another video on my channel that is very similar to this one. It's called the Jennifer Pan case, and again, it's very similar to this case. If you haven't heard of it, then obviously I'm not going to spoil it, but I will put it up in the cards up above, and I'll pop it in the description box below if you want to check it out. I think it's very interesting again. So that is actually it for this case. I hope you really enjoyed part 2 of the Gonzales family murders. So please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more from me. Please feel free to comment any suggestions for cases below in the comment section, as I love reading through my comment section, and of course I want to cover cases that you guys ultimately want to see. Thank you again so much, and I hope to see you in my next video. Bye!